In a town where flawless appearances hide dark undercurrents, one young man's silent strength is poised to challenge everything. Behind the pristine walls of Willow Creek High, beneath the surface of polished smiles and neat lawns, simmering prejudice and cruelty wait for the perfect moment to strike. This is the story of Jamal Washington, a newcomer whose quiet defiance and inner resilience set the stage for a revolution of dignity. As every whisper and sidelong glance tests him, his journey unfolds into a battle where true power is measured not by fists, but by the courage to stand tall against the tide. The battle lines are drawn. Subscribe now to our channel and dive into this riveting saga. The story begins now. The rumble of a moving truck echoed down the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek as it made its way toward a modest house in a seemingly ordinary neighborhood. Jamal Washington sat in the back seat of his mother's car, watching as strangers in uniform and burly movers began unloading boxes and furniture onto a gravel driveway that glistened under the late afternoon sun. His mother, Sharon, wore a hopeful smile as she glanced at him. "This is a fresh start, Jamal," she said softly, her voice imbued with the promise of better days. "A good school, a safe place. Everything will be different this time." But Jamal's eyes betrayed his inner thoughts. He had heard those reassuring words too many times before. Every move, every new city, had come with the same cautious optimism, only to be shadowed by the painful memories of isolation and unspoken judgments. As he stepped out of the car, the autumn air carried a scent of freshly cut grass and fallen leaves, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of change. The house before him was neat, its modest front yard trimmed with care, and the porch, though small, exuded a sense of understated dignity. Yet even in this well-kept haven, an undercurrent of apprehension stirred in Jamal's chest. He took a deep breath and adjusted the strap of his worn backpack as he observed the neighborhood's quiet rhythm. In the distance, behind lace curtains and partially drawn blinds, he sensed eyes tracking his every movement. The curious glances of neighbors and the furtive exchanges among the few who dared to watch told him that in Willow Creek, newcomers were always noticed and often judged. The steady murmur of whispered speculation seemed to follow him even before he had a chance to speak or smile. Inside, the house was bare except for freshly painted walls and wooden floors that still held a faint aroma of varnish. As the movers hurriedly arranged furniture and placed each box with mechanical precision, Jamal's mind drifted to memories of past moves, of schools where he had been seen as other, and of days spent silently enduring the sting of exclusion. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of orange and purple, Jamal lay on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. In the quiet darkness, he braced himself for what the next day might bring. A new school, a new set of challenges, but perhaps also the same old routine of feeling out of place. While Sharon busied herself with unpacking and arranging, Jamal's thoughts were tumultuous. There was hope, yes, but also a deep-rooted wariness born from years of being the outsider. He knew that no matter how pristine the neighborhood or well-kept the house appeared, the real test lay in the human connections he was about to forge and the silent battles he might have to fight every day. In that moment, as the gentle hum of the evening settled around him, Jamal silently vowed that this time, he would not allow himself to be defined by fear. Even as memories of past hurts flickered in his mind, he resolved to face whatever lay ahead with a calm determination. Today marked not just a change of address, but the beginning of a chapter that, despite its uncertainties, promised the possibility of discovering his inner strength. Yet, even as the night deepened and the soft sounds of the settling house offered a lullaby of normalcy, an unmistakable heaviness lingered in the air, a premonition that the quiet life of Willow Creek might conceal storms yet to come. Jamal's heart beat with a mix of trepidation and defiance, knowing that though the world around him looked peaceful, his journey was about to take a turn that would test not only his resolve, but the very core of who he was. And so, with the gentle whisper of the wind and the distant call of the night, Jamal drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that his new beginning was also the stage for the trials that would soon unfold. The morning light broke softly over Willow Creek High as Jamal Washington stepped onto campus with a resigned determination. The school's facade was immaculate, a modern building framed by blooming shrubs and reflective windows that mirrored a world that seemed to welcome everyone equally. Yet, as he passed through the heavy front doors, he quickly realized that acceptance wasn't guaranteed by appearances alone. In the crowded hallways, where voices overlapped and laughter reverberated off the walls, Jamal felt a chill of isolation. Students greeted him with a mixture of polite indifference and furtive curiosity. He took the back seat in his first class, his dark jeans and plain hoodie doing little to blend him into the sea of casual attire. Despite his unassuming exterior, he couldn't shake the feeling that every glance was a silent judgment, a reminder that he was different, an outsider in a community that prided itself on conformity. The initial moments in class were punctuated by whispered speculations and sidelong glances. As the teacher droned on about historical events, Jamal's eyes wandered to the window, where a small group of students huddled together, their expressions unreadable yet clearly calculating. Among them was a boy with an air of effortless authority, Zach Reynolds. His gaze, cool and dismissive, swept over Jamal as if trying to ascertain whether he was a threat or merely an easy target. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with a chaotic symphony of clattering trays, overlapping conversations, and intermittent bursts of laughter. Jamal found a quiet corner to sit alone, his tray half forgotten as he observed the interplay of cliques and alliances that defined the social hierarchy of the school. Despite his efforts to remain unnoticed, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes upon him, a silent congregation of judgment that confirmed his deepest insecurities. The unspoken divide was palpable. In every corridor, every classroom, and every whispered conversation, Jamal was cast as the new kid who didn't quite belong. He longed for the anonymity of the past, even as he craved acceptance in this strange, well-manicured world. His inner monologue was a blend of resignation and steely resolve. He had learned long ago that drawing attention to oneself often invited trouble. And trouble, in the form of derision or bullying, was something he had come to expect. Yet, amid the subtle slights and the occasional mocking smile, Jamal was quietly analyzing every interaction. He noted the way some students' eyes lingered a fraction too long, as if sizing him up, and the guarded whispers that trailed behind him in the hallways. There was a ritual here, an unspoken test to see whether he would conform to the expected norms or stand apart as a beacon of defiance. The more he observed, the clearer it became. Acceptance was not a given, and survival might well depend on his ability to navigate this precarious balance. In the quiet moments between classes, as he sat at his desk and scribbled notes with a deliberate calm, Jamal rehearsed the lessons of the past. He recalled times when showing vulnerability had led to scorn and when even a hint of emotion was exploited by those who saw him as an easy mark. With every heartbeat, he steeled himself against the barrage of stares and whispers. He knew that blending in might be his safest strategy, at least until he could figure out how to dismantle the barriers that separated him from his peers. As the day wore on and the initial buzz of first impressions began to settle, a subtle but unmistakable tension wound its way through the corridors. Jamal sensed that the quiet acceptance of his presence was merely a prelude to the more overt challenges that lay ahead. He felt the silent promise of conflict in the cool exchange of glances and the unspoken understanding that his journey at Willow Creek High was only just beginning. In that moment, with the weight of the unspoken divide pressing in from all sides, Jamal realized that this was more than just another day at school. It was the first chapter of a battle for respect, identity, and the right to be seen as more than just an outsider. It didn't take long for the undercurrents of hostility to manifest into unmistakable acts of bullying. On a brisk afternoon during gym class, as the students gathered for a friendly game of basketball, Jamal felt the atmosphere shift. The game, which began with the tentative camaraderie of strangers, quickly took on a darker tone. Amid the shouts and cheers, Jamal found himself the target of subtle yet deliberate actions, a shove here, a misdirected pass there. It was as if the game had become a covert arena for those determined to remind him that he didn't belong. The initial physical contact was so slight it could easily be dismissed as an accident. A nudge in a crowded hallway, a knocked shoulder as he reached for the ball, each incident passed without comment, yet cumulatively, they weighed heavily on him. The bullies, led by a pair of sneering upperclassmen, exchanged glances that spoke of hidden plans and calculated cruelty. Jamal, who had long mastered the art of silent endurance, kept his face impassive. He knew that any sign of vulnerability would only serve to further empower his tormentors. Later that day, as Jamal settled into a quiet corner of a nearly empty classroom, he discovered a crumpled piece of paper left conspicuously on his desk. Unfolding it slowly, he read the hastily scrawled message, "You lost. This isn't your school." The words stung more than any physical blow. They were a declaration, a message meant to strip him of any semblance of belonging. Yet even as anger boiled beneath the surface, Jamal forced himself to remain composed. He tucked the note away, unwilling to give his adversaries the satisfaction of a reaction. During the lunch break, the tension in the cafeteria was palpable. As he walked slowly toward an empty table, he caught fleeting looks of curiosity and thinly veiled derision. One student's expression changed imperceptibly from mild interest to something more calculating, and Jamal knew that the scrutiny was intensifying. The day's earlier events had set the tone. Here, in this supposedly benign environment, every gesture, every word was loaded with the intent to demean. After class, while most students hurried out of the building, Jamal lingered in the hall, gathering his scattered books from a toppled locker. It was then that he felt it most acutely, the weight of countless eyes watching his every move, as if measuring his worth and plotting his downfall. Even in the fading light of a late afternoon, the corridors seemed to echo with the unspoken message, "You're different, and here, difference is a target." Yet despite the mounting pressure and the silent onslaught of insults, Jamal maintained his quiet dignity. He recalled the many times he learned that giving even the slightest reaction could escalate the situation. Instead, he chose to internalize his pain, to let the hurt be a silent reminder of what he must overcome. In that crucible of everyday torment, he began to understand that survival in this hostile world required more than endurance. It demanded a resolve that could transform pain into strength. As the final bell rang, marking the end of a day that had left its indelible scars, Jamal stepped out into the cool evening air. The sky, painted with the soft glow of twilight, offered a deceptive calm. Yet beneath that calm lay a storm brewing, a storm of injustice and cruelty that would not be easily quelled. Jamal's heart, heavy with the day's trials, beat with a steady, determined rhythm. He knew that these early signs of trouble were but the beginning of a long, arduous journey. With each step away from the school building, he vowed silently that no matter how relentless the bullying became, he would not let it define him. For in the quiet recesses of his soul, a spark of defiance was igniting, a spark that promised that one day, he would reclaim his dignity and rewrite the rules of the game. That afternoon, as the school day drew to a close, the corridors of Willow Creek High buzzed with a foreboding energy that hinted at more than just idle gossip. The casual cruelty of earlier incidents had given way to a deliberate, premeditated challenge. As Jamal gathered his belongings in the nearly deserted hallways, the subtle menace of his bullies began to crystallize into a bold display of aggression. Without warning, a heavy hand knocked against his back, sending a ripple of shock through his body. Jamal's eyes met those of Zach Reynolds, whose earlier dismissive glance had hardened into a look of cold calculation. Alongside Zach, Mason, a broad-shouldered enforcer with a reputation for ruthlessness, stepped forward. Their presence was unmistakable, a silent declaration that Jamal was now in their crosshairs. There were no words, only the weight of expectation in the charged silence. "Come on," Sharon's voice echoed in his memory from that very morning, urging him to be strong, to face the day head-on. Yet in that moment, Jamal felt as though he were walking a tightrope suspended over a chasm of unspoken threats. His mind raced as he recalled every incident, each shove in the hall, every whispered insult, now converging into this defining moment. The challenge was set, and his tormentors were determined to force a reaction. The group circled him in the narrow corridor, their eyes gleaming with a mix of amusement and menace. Mason's knuckles flexed imperceptibly, as if priming himself for the inevitable confrontation, while Zach's smirk hinted at satisfaction in the control he was about to assert. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he forced his face into a mask of impassivity. He had learned well that anger was a luxury he could ill afford. For a long, excruciating moment, the world around him seemed to slow to a crawl. Every footstep echoed ominously, every whispered comment magnified into a threat. In the midst of the tension, Jamal's inner voice urged him to keep his cool. His mind replayed the lessons of countless past altercations. Each time he had let his guard down, it had only emboldened his adversaries. Now, the stakes were higher, and the silence of his response was the only shield that could deflect their aggression. Without a word, he stepped back, putting a deliberate distance between himself and the circle of bullies. The unspoken test was underway. His indifference was a challenge to their authority, a defiant refusal to be drawn into a fight on their terms. In that instant, a silent gamble was made. Jamal's calm was not weakness, but a calculated strategy to unbalance his attackers, an assurance that his silence was not submission but an acknowledgement of his inner strength. As he turned and walked away, the corridor filled with a heavy, charged silence. Behind him, the bullies exchanged looks, mixtures of frustration and reluctant admiration for the composure he had displayed. Yet, as the door closed behind him, it was clear that their challenge was far from over. They had tasted the thrill of confrontation and were now more determined than ever to provoke a reaction. For them, every step Jamal took was a reminder of the difference he represented, a difference they were desperate to erase. Outside the building, under the fading light of day, Jamal paused for a moment to catch his breath. The cool air brushed against his skin, and in that pause, he realized that he was no longer merely enduring these tests, he was learning from them. Each challenge was a lesson in restraint and resolve, a lesson that would prepare him for the battles yet to come. Though the encounter had ended with him walking away, the message was clear. His silence was not acceptance. It was the calm before a storm that he would one day unleash on those who had wronged him. With a heavy heart but a mind sharpened by determination, Jamal resumed his journey home, each step echoing with the promise that tomorrow would be another day, a day on which he would be forced to choose between submission and the quiet assertion of his inner strength. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Willow Creek High grew increasingly charged with tension. What began as subtle pranks soon escalated into acts that left no doubt. The unwritten rules of power in the school were being forcefully rewritten. Jamal soon found himself at the center of a relentless campaign designed to humiliate and isolate him. His chair would vanish before class, only to reappear in a distant corner of the room as if mocking his inability to belong. In the grimy sanctuary of the school bathroom, crude graffiti, scribbled in haste, appeared on the walls and on his locker, a constant reminder that he was not welcome. Each incident was orchestrated with a disturbing precision. One morning, Jamal discovered that his books had been scattered across the hallway, as if someone had deliberately taken pleasure in disrupting his order. The humiliation was compounded by the fact that these acts were performed in plain sight, with students and teachers alike too frightened or indifferent to intervene. In every whispered remark and sidelong glance, Jamal sensed that he was being judged, not merely for being different, but for daring to exist in a space where conformity was the law. Determined not to let these provocations define him, Jamal began to retreat further into himself. Yet, even as he withdrew, a quiet resolve was building beneath the surface. Every act of humiliation, every small injustice, was a spark that ignited the embers of his determination. When the bell rang each day, signaling the start of another gauntlet of torment, Jamal would gather his scattered strength and proceed, as if each step were a deliberate march towards something greater, a promise that one day he would no longer be the victim. After class, when most students hurried away to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the hallways, Jamal would retreat to a quiet corner of the schoolyard. There, beneath the fading light of dusk, he found solace in solitude. With the distant hum of conversation and laughter echoing off the walls, he would sit and reflect on the lessons of restraint he had learned over the years. He recalled the countless moments when anger had been his enemy and calm had been his shield. It was in these quiet moments of introspection that Jamal resolved to turn each slight, each act of cruelty, into a stepping stone toward his own empowerment. At home, the sanctuary of his modest room became a training ground. In the solitude of his own space, Jamal took to a battered punching bag that hung in the corner, a relic from a time when he first learned to fight. But now, every strike was a measured act, a physical manifestation of the inner strength that had been growing steadily, almost imperceptibly, over time. The repetitive rhythm of his training was both cathartic and empowering. With every punch, every dodge, he reminded himself that while his body bore the marks of past struggles, his spirit remained unbroken. Yet, the unwritten rules of power extended beyond physical strength. They seeped into every corner of the school culture, a culture that valued control over compassion, dominance over empathy. Even as Jamal's quiet defiance began to draw whispered acknowledgments of respect, he knew that respect was a fragile currency in this world. The bullies, emboldened by their own twisted sense of superiority, were not content to simply assert their dominance through crude pranks and half-whispered insults. They were waiting for a moment of weakness, a single spark that would ignite a full-blown confrontation. In the dead of night, as shadows danced on the walls and the hum of distant city sounds mingled with his own measured breathing, Jamal would lie awake and consider the true cost of survival. He had learned that power in Willow Creek was not given. It was seized, often at the expense of those too timid to fight back. And though he longed for a day when he would no longer need to prove himself, he knew that the current state of affairs left him with little choice. Every act of resistance, every silent refusal to be broken, was an investment in a future where he might finally reclaim the dignity that had been so callously stripped away. As the days blurred into weeks, the unspoken war continued. In every classroom, every crowded corridor, and every clandestine glance exchanged among the students, the battle for power raged on silently. And amid it all, Jamal Washington grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. With each passing day, he was no longer just enduring the unwritten rules of power. He was beginning to master them, turning every slight into an opportunity to refine his resolve and prepare for the inevitable reckoning. One crisp morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Jamal arrived at school to confront a sight that chilled him to the core. Dominating the side of the aging school building was a message that transcended petty pranks. It was a brazen act of defiance, an attempt to erase his very identity. Bold black spray paint had transformed a once innocuous wall into a canvas of hatred, the letters forming a vile racial slur that screamed of exclusion and malice. Students gathered, their whispers a mixture of shock and uncertainty, as teachers hurried to scrub the wall clean. Yet no matter how vigorously they tried, the stain of the message lingered, a stubborn reminder of the cruelty that had taken root. Jamal's heart pounded as he stood frozen before the wall. Every word, every line of that abhorrent message was a personal indictment, a statement meant to strip him of his dignity and to remind him that he did not belong. In that moment, the quiet normalcy of Willow Creek High shattered. Even the usually indifferent faces of his classmates betrayed a flicker of discomfort. It was as if the entire community, whether through apathy or fear, had conspired to let hatred run unchecked. Inside the school, the tension was palpable. The administration issued a generic statement of regret, promising that the incident would be investigated and that measures would be taken to ensure such behavior was not repeated. But Jamal knew that words alone would never undo the damage. The message was not just a stain on a wall. It was an attack on his very soul, a challenge that demanded more than passive acceptance. At lunch that day, the atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken understanding. Jamal's table was isolated by default, a quiet island in a sea of uneasy chatter. Even as he tried to focus on his food, the echoes of the hateful words resonated in his mind. In the midst of the stifling silence, his thoughts drifted to his mother's soft admonishments from that very morning, urging him to be strong and not let these acts define him. Yet, as he met the eyes of a sympathetic classmate, he also sensed pity, a silent acknowledgement that what he was enduring was not right, that the scales of justice were woefully imbalanced. That afternoon, after classes had ended and the final bell tolled, Jamal retreated to the quiet solitude of the school's back corridors. The weight of the day pressed upon him, each step measured and heavy with the burden of accumulated injustice. It was in that dim light, with the echoes of his footsteps the only company, that he felt the edges of his resolve begin to fray. The relentless barrage of humiliation, from shattered belongings to cruel graffiti, had worn him down, and now, faced with the stark, unyielding reality of public hatred, his inner world teetered on the brink of breaking. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a spark of defiance was ignited deep within. Jamal recalled every moment of silent endurance, every time he had refused to give his tormentors the satisfaction of a reaction. He recognized that the breaking point was not a moment of surrender but a call to action, a signal that he could no longer allow these attacks to define his existence. With trembling hands and a racing heart, he reached for his phone and sent a message, a plea for help that carried the weight of his pain and the promise of retribution. Later that evening, as the sun sank below the horizon and darkness cloaked the halls of the school, Jamal sat in his room. The haunting image of the spray-painted wall burned into his mind. His mother's gentle presence, a quiet anchor in a storm of uncertainty, provided a brief respite. "I'm sorry, Jamal," she whispered, her eyes filled with concern. "You shouldn't have to face this alone." But Jamal, his voice low and resolute, replied that this was not a matter for pity. It was a battle that he would fight on his own terms. He had reached the breaking point, and in that painful realization, he understood that the war against hatred was far from over. As he lay down that night, the echoes of the hateful words mingled with the promise of an inner strength that was just beginning to awaken, a strength that would soon demand that those responsible for his suffering answer for their cruelty. That same evening, as twilight deepened into a quiet, reflective darkness, Jamal sensed that the tide was beginning to turn. Every bruise and every scar, physical and emotional, had slowly forged him into a man who no longer cowered before injustice. The following morning, the air at Willow Creek High was thick with a tension that went beyond the usual undercurrent of teenage mischief. As Jamal stepped onto the campus, he could almost feel the eyes of his peers and even a few teachers weighing him down, as if waiting for a sign that he would finally break. Yet, amid that suffocating pressure, a steely determination radiated from him. That day, as classes progressed and the usual quiet murmurs of discontent filled the hallways, Jamal found himself retracing the familiar route to his locker. Each step was accompanied by a growing awareness that something was different, an almost imperceptible shift in the energy that surrounded him. As he reached his locker, he saw it slightly ajar, his textbooks scattered on the floor in a chaotic display. Though the act was nearly routine by now, it struck him with a sharper sting. This was not just an act of mischief. It was a declaration of war. Later, in the waning hours of the afternoon, as the final classes ended and the building slowly emptied, Jamal lingered in the corridors, absorbing every sound. The hushed whispers, the soft creaks of lockers closing, and the distant murmurs of groups gathering. Then, he heard them, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing behind him. Without needing to turn, he sensed the presence of those who had made it their mission to break him. It was Zach, Mason, and a couple of their cronies, closing in with an energy that was palpably different from earlier skirmishes. This was no random encounter. This was a carefully orchestrated moment, a turning point that would force Jamal to confront his tormentors head-on. Zach's voice cut through the silence, low and mocking. "You're a hard guy to get a reaction from, aren't you, Jamal?" There was no cheer in his tone, only a cold challenge. Jamal's eyes met Zach's for a brief, charged moment, and in that glance lay the unspoken understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The air around them seemed to crackle with anticipation, a promise of imminent conflict that was as inevitable as it was dangerous. For a long, heavy moment, neither side spoke. The gathered onlookers, a motley crew of curious students who had been lingering in the background, watched with bated breath. In that silence, Jamal realized that his refusal to react had given his enemies something unexpected, a measure of control they had never quite anticipated. His unflappable demeanor, honed through years of silent endurance, had disrupted their plans. Yet, it was also clear that his restraint had stoked their anger. They had come to test him, to force him to cross the invisible line that separated passive endurance from active rebellion. Inside Jamal's mind, a decision was taking shape. He could continue to deflect their provocations with his usual calm, or he could choose to let this moment define him, once and for all. The memory of the spray-painted wall, the whispered insults, and the countless moments of isolation converged in a singular, overwhelming thought. Enough was enough. With measured steps, he turned to face his challengers. His voice was steady, betraying none of the tumult within. "I'm not interested in your games," he stated simply, each word a declaration of defiance. The group hesitated, the atmosphere thickening as the balance of power shifted ever so slightly. In that charged moment, the weight of every slight and every act of cruelty was laid bare before them. Jamal's unwavering gaze and resolute tone sent a message that he was done being the target. Whatever came next, he was ready. As murmurs began to ripple through the small crowd, the turning point was unmistakable. Jamal was no longer the silent victim. With a quiet determination, he took a step back, allowing his presence to speak louder than any angry retort could. In that decisive act, the course of their future interactions was irrevocably altered. The battle lines had been redrawn, and though the scars of the past remained, Jamal sensed that the tide was finally beginning to turn in his favor. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally erupted on a cool afternoon just after school. The usual hum of conversation in the hallway was replaced by a palpable hush as students instinctively formed a ring around a secluded section near the gym. It was here that Mason, the imposing enforcer of Zach's crew, decided to make his move. With a sudden, aggressive lunge, he swung his fist toward Jamal, a move so swift and unanticipated that for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to suspend. Jamal, anticipating that this was the moment they had all been building toward, reacted with a measured grace that belied the raw energy of the situation. Instead of flinching or retaliating with reckless abandon, he shifted his weight subtly, his eyes never leaving Mason's. The punch whistled past him, missing its target by mere inches, and in that split second, the assembled crowd exhaled collectively. Their shock was not just at the missed blow. It was at the realization that Jamal was not the hapless victim they had expected. With every muscle tensed and every sense honed by years of unspoken struggle, Jamal's body moved like a well-rehearsed symphony of defense. Mason swung again, this time a follow-up strike aimed at his ribs. Jamal pivoted, the movement fluid and almost balletic, evading the blow by mere inches. The sound of fists meeting air echoed sharply in the silent corridor. The bullies' expressions shifted from confident malice to a dawning uncertainty as they began to understand that their target was not only unyielding but possessed a strength born of necessity. Zach, who had been standing off to the side with a sneering smirk moments earlier, now watched with growing apprehension. His eyes darted between Jamal's composed stance and Mason's frustrated efforts. It was as if the dynamics of power were being recalibrated right before everyone's eyes. Jamal's calm defiance, combined with the measured precision of his evasive moves, sent a clear message. He was not about to give them the reaction they craved. For a fleeting moment, the silence was broken only by the rapid cadence of heavy breathing and the scuffling of feet. Then, without a word, Jamal countered, a swift, controlled motion that diverted Mason's momentum. In the process, Mason lost his balance and stumbled forward. The crowd gasped, and for the first time, the bully's aura of invincibility wavered. Jamal's counterattack wasn't born out of blind aggression. It was a deliberate, well-practiced response honed through years of training and tempered by experience. He blocked a further desperate attempt by another of the group, his movements economical and decisive. As the confrontation unfolded, Jamal maintained a relentless focus on not escalating the situation unnecessarily. Every dodge, every measured parry, was executed with the intent of defense rather than provocation. His mind was a blend of calm strategy and simmering resolve. While Mason and the others floundered in their attempts to force him into a reaction, Jamal's composed demeanor left no doubt. He would not be goaded into a fight that would only serve their twisted agenda. When the melee finally subsided, the corridor was thick with disbelief. The bullies, once so confident in their ability to subdue him, now wore expressions of stunned uncertainty. Jamal's silence and his precise, controlled defense had turned the tide. Zach's smirk had evaporated into a frown of contemplation as he realized that his crew's aggression had backfired. For a few long moments, the entire student body seemed to hold its breath, absorbing the unexpected shift in power dynamics. As the small crowd slowly dispersed, Jamal took a final, steadying breath. He didn't raise a fist or hurl insults in retaliation. His quiet defiance had already spoken volumes. In that moment, the first strike had been thrown, not by Jamal, but by fate, and he had met it with a measured calm that resonated with every watching eye. The bullies retreated into the shadows of the hallway, their plans disrupted, while Jamal's resolve crystallized further. He understood that this was only the beginning, a single, decisive moment that would forever alter the unwritten rules of the schoolyard. And though the scars of the encounter would remain, so too would the knowledge that he was more than just a target. He was a fighter, a man who could transform even the most aggressive assault into an opportunity for quiet, unyielding triumph. In the days following that fateful afternoon, rumors began to swirl through the corridors of Willow Creek High like wildfire. Whispers of Jamal's near-mythical composure during the confrontation reached every corner of the school. Some students claimed that he had not only evaded Mason's strikes, but had turned the tables so effortlessly that it seemed as if he had anticipated every move. Others exaggerated the tale, insisting that Jamal had, with barely a flicker of effort, sent his attackers sprawling, an almost superhuman display of calm and strength that bordered on the legendary. In hushed conversations, he was no longer just the new kid or the quiet outsider. He was becoming a symbol of resilience, an embodiment of the principle that true power lay in self-control. Yet for Jamal, the incident was not about glory, it was about survival. Every action, every measured move during the confrontation was the result of years of training and painful experience. As the days passed, he found that the shift in the atmosphere was as tangible as it was subtle. Students who had once avoided his gaze now regarded him with a mixture of awe and cautious respect. Even teachers, who typically maintained a distant detachment from student conflicts, offered him nods of approval or quiet words of encouragement in the hallways. Still, the bullies were far from defeated. Their pride, bruised by the unexpected reversal, fueled a determination to reassert their dominance. In whispered meetings behind closed doors and furtive glances exchanged in the cafeteria, Zach and his crew began plotting their next move. Their objective was clear: restore the old order, where Jamal was nothing more than a target to be humiliated at every turn. Every deliberate act of provocation, the misplaced notebook, the tampered locker, the furtive push in the corridor, was designed to chip away at his newfound defiance and remind him that, in their eyes, he was still the outsider. Jamal, however, had grown tired of being defined by their petty rules. Every act of cruelty only served to deepen his resolve. He began spending long hours after school in the quiet isolation of the community center's gym, working on his techniques and refining his ability to defend himself without losing the calm that had become his greatest strength. With each drop of sweat, he transformed anger and hurt into focus, a determination that what had been a painful existence would soon give way to a rebalancing of power. His training wasn't just about physical fitness. It was a meditation on control, a silent promise that he would not be reduced to a pawn in someone else's game. The battle lines, once so sharply drawn by the bullies, were now blurred by the simple fact of Jamal's resilience. He understood that while the physical confrontations might come and go, the war for respect and dignity was fought in quieter moments. Moments of silent endurance, of controlled defiance, and of a will so unyielding that even the harshest provocations could not break it. And so, as the days stretched on and the school's corridors continued to hum with tension, Jamal walked with a quiet confidence that defied the expectations of those around him. He was no longer a passive recipient of cruelty. In every step he took, in every glance he exchanged with both friend and foe, there was an unmistakable assertion that he had claimed his place in a world that had once tried to erase him. The bullies, now more desperate than ever, began to see that their attempts to subdue him were not working as intended. Their power was waning, and with it, the old order of the school was shifting. And while the scars of past insults and physical blows would remain, Jamal's determination only grew stronger, a silent vow that he would redefine the meaning of strength on his own terms. A palpable tension hung in the air one cool afternoon as Jamal stepped out of the school building. The corridors had quieted to a hush that felt heavy with anticipation. Today was different. Word had spread that Zach, Mason, and several other members of their crew would be waiting near the gym, a place that had become their unofficial battleground. The growing circle of onlookers was a living testament to the changing dynamics within the school. Students who had once cowered in the background now gathered with eyes full of expectancy, eager to witness what would undoubtedly be a climactic showdown. Jamal's heart pounded steadily as he advanced toward the designated area. Each step was measured and deliberate, his every movement a quiet defiance against the oppressive force that had long sought to diminish him. There, standing in the fading light, was Zach, flanked by Mason and 3 other figures whose expressions were hardened with a mix of determination and fury. The bully's posture was one of challenge, every muscle tense as if ready to erupt into violence. The circle of onlookers formed a tight ring around the confrontation zone, their whispers and murmurs punctuating the heavy silence. In that charged atmosphere, Mason stepped forward first, His expression was set in a snarl as he lunged at Jamal with a powerful, calculated blow. But Jamal's training took over. With a fluid motion reminiscent of a practiced dance, he sidestepped the attack, allowing Mason's momentum to carry him off balance. The impact of the near miss sent a ripple through the gathered crowd, eliciting gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Jamal's eyes were cold and focused, each movement deliberate as he countered with a series of precise, measured strikes that used his attacker's own force against him. The confrontation escalated quickly. As Mason recovered, another member of the crew charged forward, but Jamal parried the attack with a deft twist that left the aggressor stumbling backward. The rhythm of the fight was almost hypnotic, a series of swift dodges, redirects, and well-timed counters that showcased not just physical prowess but a deep inner discipline. Zach, who had so far been a mere observer of his crew's actions, now stepped into the fray. His face, once filled with confident derision, was now etched with a trace of uncertainty as he realized that his authority was slipping away. For a long, silent moment, the air held its breath. Jamal, still composed and in control, advanced steadily towards Zach. Every eye in the ring was fixed on the two, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. With a calm yet unwavering tone, Jamal spoke softly. "I told you, I'm not interested." His words carried the weight of every painful lesson learned, every act of silent endurance that had led him to this defining moment. The challenge was not in the physical blows exchanged, but in the reclaiming of dignity that had been denied him for so long. The tension broke as the crowd collectively exhaled. Zach's hardened features flickered with an emotion that was neither anger nor pride, but something more vulnerable, doubt. Slowly, as if the weight of his own actions had finally caught up with him, Zach's posture slumped imperceptibly. With one final, inscrutable glance at Jamal, he turned and walked away, leaving behind his former cronies who now dispersed into the gathering twilight. For Jamal, the final confrontation was less about violence and more about the quiet reclamation of power. In that moment, he had not only defended himself, but had also sent a clear message to everyone in Willow Creek High. He was no longer the victim, and the old rules of domination had been irreversibly rewritten. As the ring of onlookers gradually dissolved into scattered groups, Jamal stood alone in the fading light, feeling both the heavy toll of the battle and the sweet taste of hard-won respect. His heart, steady and resolute, beat as a reminder that sometimes the most profound victories are won not by the fist, but by the quiet power of unyielding self-respect. In the aftermath of that final showdown, an unmistakable shift began to ripple through the halls of Willow Creek High. The school, once dominated by an unspoken hierarchy enforced by fear and cruelty, now seemed to have taken on a different tone, a subtle, yet palpable, change in the way students related to one another. Gone were the days of overt mockery and relentless bullying. In their place was a cautious respect, a tentative acknowledgement that Jamal Washington had fundamentally altered the balance of power. Every morning, as Jamal strode through the corridors, his head held high and his eyes calm, yet resolute, he noticed small changes that signaled the transformation. Classmates who had once avoided him now offered quiet nods of acknowledgement. In hallways where whispers had previously cut like daggers, the murmurs now carried hints of admiration and even curiosity. Even the teachers, who had long maintained a detached distance from the daily drama of school life, seemed to regard him with a newfound respect. One afternoon, as he walked past a classroom, Mr. Reynolds, a quiet history teacher with deep-set eyes and a reputation for keen observation, offered Jamal a nod that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Yet, the transformation wasn't merely external. Internally, Jamal felt a shift that went far deeper than the changing expressions of his peers. The days of silent endurance and muted defiance had culminated in a moment of self-realization, that his strength was not measured by his ability to absorb cruelty, but by his unwavering commitment to rise above it. With each deliberate step through the school's corridors, he was rewriting his narrative, casting aside the role of the perennial victim in favor of that of a young man who had fought his battles with quiet dignity and emerged victorious. Still, even as the power dynamics began to realign, there were those among the old bullies who struggled to let go of their former dominance. Mason and the others, who had once reveled in the chaos of confrontation, now moved in the background, silent, watchful, and noticeably subdued. The absence of their usual raucous laughter in the cafeteria and the avoidance of Jamal's steady gaze in the hallways were silent testaments to the fact that their reign of terror had lost its potency. In hushed conversations, whispers of Jamal's earlier feats spread like wildfire, morphing him into a symbol of resilience and change. For many, he was no longer just the new kid or the target of ridicule. He was a beacon of hope for those who had long suffered in silence. Outside of school, the ripple effect was equally profound. Neighbors who had once eyed the Washington family with reserved suspicion now offered small, encouraging smiles when they crossed paths. Even his mother, Sharon, whose hopeful optimism had driven them to Willow Creek in the first place, now saw in her son a quiet strength that promised a future free from the shadow of constant persecution. Over dinner at home, as they spoke in subdued tones about the day's events, there was a shared understanding that a new chapter had begun, one where respect had replaced ridicule and determination had eclipsed despair. Despite the newfound peace, Jamal remained vigilant. He knew that the echoes of past cruelty could resurface at any moment, and that the fragile balance of power was a constant battle. But in that ongoing struggle, he had discovered something invaluable, that courage often meant standing tall even when the odds were stacked against you. With every heartbeat and every quiet stride, Jamal embraced the responsibility of his own narrative, a narrative where the scars of yesterday became the stepping stones for a stronger tomorrow. As the days turned into weeks, the school's atmosphere evolved into something almost unrecognizable from its former self. The oppressive tension of domination had given way to an environment where empathy began to take root, and where even those who had once enforced the old rules now appeared to be grappling with the consequences of their actions. In the midst of this transformation, Jamal realized that true power was not in inflicting pain, but in inspiring change. And so, with a quiet determination and a heart full of cautious hope, he continued his journey, knowing that while the battle for respect was far from over, the shifting tide promised a future where every student, regardless of background, could finally be seen for who they truly were. In the quiet aftermath of conflict, when the echoes of confrontation had settled into a new rhythm, Jamal Washington found himself standing at the crossroads of transformation. No longer defined solely by the fights he'd endured or the battles he'd silently fought, he began to realize that his true strength lay not in his ability to dodge a punch or counter a blow, but in the resilience of his spirit. Walking through the transformed corridors of Willow Creek High, he sensed that his journey had transcended the realm of schoolyard disputes. He was becoming something more, a symbol of quiet defiance, a living testament to the power of self-respect. Every day brought a renewed sense of purpose. The whispers in the hallways, once laden with mockery and fear, had softened into expressions of cautious admiration. Even the teachers, who had once regarded him as an enigma, now offered genuine smiles and encouraging nods. Jamal began to see that the respect he had earned was not just a fleeting sentiment, but the foundation of a community slowly learning to value integrity over cruelty. For many of his peers, his steady presence was a reminder that one's worth was not measured by the scars of past battles, but by the strength with which one rose above them. At home, the transformation was equally profound. His mother, Sharon, no longer worried about the toll that the relentless bullying might exact on her son's spirit. Instead, she celebrated the quiet victories, the small moments of dignity and self-assurance that had begun to define Jamal's everyday life. Their modest home, once filled with anxious energy, now hummed with a subdued joy, as if each room bore witness to the blossoming of a young man reclaiming his identity. Over late-night conversations and shared silences, Jamal reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, a journey marked by pain, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that he was more than the sum of his hardships. Yet, even as he embraced the role of a quiet champion, Jamal remained aware that the road ahead would not always be smooth. The vestiges of past animosities still lingered in the corners of Willow Creek High, and the ghosts of old rivalries whispered of unresolved tensions. But now, armed with a deep understanding of his own strength, He knew that he could meet any challenge with the same calm resolve that had carried him this far. His training sessions in the gym evolved from bursts of physical exertion into meditative exercises, a time to reflect, to center himself, and to remember that true power was a state of mind. As the final days of the school year unfolded, a quiet celebration of change began to take shape. Former bullies, once so confident in their ability to control, now found themselves isolated by the very community they had once dominated. Rumors circulated that even Zach Reynolds, the once feared architect of cruelty, was rethinking his role in the school's hierarchy. In hushed moments, students would remark on how the unspoken rules had shifted, how respect, earned through quiet perseverance, had supplanted fear and derision. And in every corner of the school, from the bustling cafeteria to the silent hallways, there was an unmistakable sense that something fundamental had changed. For Jamal, the journey was far from over. The lessons learned from every bruise and every moment of silent endurance had forged him into someone who understood that fighting wasn't always about throwing punches. Sometimes, the most profound battles were fought in the quiet recesses of the heart, where courage and self-worth were nurtured in spite of adversity. Standing on the threshold of a new chapter, one that promised both challenges and opportunities, Jamal felt a deep, abiding gratitude for every moment that had led him to this point. He realized that he was not defined by the violence of the past, but by the quiet strength that allowed him to rise above it. In that realization lay the ultimate victory, a transformation that turned a fighter into a leader, a target into a symbol of hope. And as he walked through the corridors of Willow Creek High one final time that year, he carried with him the promise that his journey, one of pain, perseverance, and ultimate triumph, was only just beginning. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories to life. See you in the next one.